carried. We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. And before we recognize the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, I want to remind all members that the use of electronic communication devices is strictly prohibited during question period. The time is now 3:01 p.m. We will finish at 4:01 p.m. I recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Yesterday, I asked the Premier how many candidates there were for the job of Chief of Protocol, and he didn't answer. According to a CTV reports, the Premier says, and I quote, "Some names were brought forward, and I will table that news item for the House." My simple question for the Premier today, is the CTV report accurate?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I first of all want to again today congratulate and thank the outgoing Chief Protocol Officer for the tremendous work he's done on behalf of people of Nova Scotia. Speaker, I again want to remind this House that we hired a 30-year veteran of this province, someone who's worked both as a journalist and both in public and private sector, doing work on behalf of her clients. Mr. Speaker, communicating. Mr. Speaker, as well, we hired her on a contract basis where she's being paid less than the outgoing Chief Protocol Officer, Mr. Speaker. And by the way, there is no buyout at the end of this contract. Mr. Speaker, unlike when the Leader of the Conservative Party was hired by the former Conservative government when he negotiated for himself a $20,000 raise for the position that he was applying for, Mr. Speaker. Not only that, Mr. Speaker, he negotiated for himself on the back end a full year's salary, which would amount to $124,000. Mr. Speaker, we're doing exactly what Nova Scotians hired us to do, and that is protect their hard-earned money.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, I see that the old, angry, and attack dog Premier has now returned. Let me just say, first of all, Mr. Speaker, that nothing that he just said is accurate. I negotiated no such thing. And for the benefit of all members of this House, I did work in a Premier's office once, and I did leave, and my severance was exactly $0, Mr. Speaker. So let's be clear about that. I also want to remind the Premier that during the election, Mr. Speaker, the Premier is quoted on Reddit, on the online service Reddit, in an Ask Me Anything session, as saying, quote, "Openness and transparency are values I believe in, and are values I will carry into government, and I will table that statement of fact." Mr. Speaker, the Premier has given us the same non-answer to our simple questions now 10 times in a row. I will ask him to live up to the words that he spoke during the election. I will try again with a simple question. How many names were brought forward for the job of Chief of Protocol, and where did they come from?
Just before I recognize the Honourable Premier, I want to remind the Honourable Leader of the Opposition to keep the language parliamentary in the description of the Premier, please. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very proud of the fact that the Minister of Economic Rural Development has tabled a piece of legislation that will make this House, when it comes to economic development, more accountable than any House, Mr. Speaker, in the entire country. And Mr. Speaker, let me clear up the misconception that was brought forward by the Leader of the Conservative Party. He actually negotiated a severance package, Mr. Speaker, if his contract was terminated. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, they were returned to power. Nova Scotians had to suffer through another term of a Conservative government. Mr. Speaker, at that point, he moved into the private sector. But let's be very clear. His contract had a $124,000 severance if that contract was terminated. There is no such, Mr. Speaker, there is no such clause in any contract that I've negotiated as Premier of the province of Nova Scotia.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Well, Mr. Speaker, nothing that the Premier just said is accurate, for the record. Perhaps we need a bill that makes the Premier of Nova Scotia accountable for his own actions as well as the Minister of Economic Development. Yesterday I asked the Premier if this hiring of a Chief of Protocol followed his own government's fair hiring policy, and he answered yes, although I now understand his officials, in fact, are saying no. Clearly, he skirted his own policy to hire his friend and fellow Liberal. My question to the Premier is, why is he hiding the details, simple details like was it advertised and how many names came forward, instead of being open and transparent as he promised to do during the election?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we were the party that actually told Nova Scotians of the appointment, Mr. Speaker, and to correct what the leader of the Conservative Party has just said, Mr. Speaker, if you look at any protocol position in this province, whether it is the Chief Secretary to the Lieutenant Governor, Mr. Speaker, it is a hire that is done by the person coming in. Same thing when it comes to the Chief Protocol Officer in the province of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. But I want to be clear, Mr. Speaker. Every opportunity that the leader of the Conservative Party has had, Mr. Speaker, when it has come to public money, he has made sure he's protected his own wallet. When he negotiated a contract for himself, it was $124,000, Mr. Speaker. And I want to, Mr. Speaker.
Order, please. Order, please. I would remind all the members that the Premier has the floor at the moment, and I would remind all the members to direct, when you have the floor, to direct your comments through the chair, please. The Honourable Premier.
Just in case, with all the noise in the House, you didn't hear what I had to say, I want to make it clear that when the leader of the Conservative Party negotiated for himself a contract, he made sure he negotiated a full year's salary at $124,000, Mr. Speaker. But even better, Mr. Speaker, when he left, Mr. Speaker, the Premier's office in the private sector, he called upon his friend, Mr. Harper, who appointed him to 2 appointments and provided him over $300,000 in taxpayers' money, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker. So clearly, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to being open and transparent, it applies to everyone else but the leader of the Conservative Party.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, in 2003, the Conservative government of the day appointed a former Chief of Staff from federal PC Cabinet Minister Kim Campbell's office to the position of Director of Corporate Communications for the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation. And at that time, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to table an article quoting the member of Preston, now the Fisheries Minister, who told the Daily News that the person responsible for this hiring should, I quote, quit or be fired for such a blatant act of patronage. So, Mr. Speaker, my question to the Premier is this. Does he believe the patronage appointment of the Director of Corporate Communications for the Nova Scotia Liquor Corporation in 2003 was wrong, and that his Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture was correct when he said that the person responsible for this patronage hiring should be held accountable?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Mr. Speaker, what this government did, Mr. Speaker, was hire a qualified person to fill a vacancy, Mr. Speaker, that was left vacant by a 30-year person who decided to retire, Mr. Speaker. And in keeping in this province, all protocol jobs, Mr. Speaker, those associated to the Lieutenant Governor's position and those, Mr. Speaker, associated here have been hires that have been made by the government, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's quite interesting that the leader of the New Democratic Party is standing in this House trying to lecture anyone when in actual fact, Mr. Speaker, in the last cabinet meeting they had, they saw fit to not only were they going to reward their political friends with very generous severance packages, they decided to top it up to a tune of $250,000. So, Mr. Speaker, so the taxpayers not only had to change governments, Mr. Speaker, but they had to pay out almost $1 million to the NDP political appointees.
Leader of the New Democratic Party on her first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, I know why the Leader of the government, the Premier, is attempting to deflect from being accountable for the patronage appointment he just made. He thinks this isn't an important issue. He told reporters moments ago in the scrum that people on Main Street don't care about patronage in Nova Scotia, and in fact he's had very few emails on this or phone calls. But perhaps the Fisheries Minister was one of those people who contacted him. Given that, Mr. Speaker, the member from Preston, back in 2003, on the Tory patronage appointment, also had this to say about that appointment. He said, and I quote from the Daily News, "This begs the question, Mr. Speaker, what else is going on?"
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What's going on is good government in the province of Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, with every contract that has been signed by this Premier, Mr. Speaker, there is no buyout clause at any of them, Mr. Speaker, and they all can be terminated by any future government at any time, Mr. Speaker. Unlike, Mr. Speaker, the NDP, who were in power just a few short months ago. And what did they do in the secrecy of the cabinet room in the dying days? They bumped up severances that were already generous for their political friends, Mr. Speaker, so that not only did we turf the NDP government, but we got a bill for severances for $1 million to look after, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party on her final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the past 18 months, 2 other provinces have filled the position of Chief of Protocol. Mr. Speaker, in both cases, they had well-defined job descriptions, they had open and transparent hiring processes that were arm's length from the Cabinet and the Premier. They had hiring committees with members of chiefs of protocol from other provinces on them, and an independent panel, merit-based hiring, Mr. Speaker. So I want to ask the Premier, why wouldn't you follow a fair hiring process, moving Nova Scotia forward instead of backward to the dark days of patronage in the province of Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Premier.
For a minute there, when she said the dark days, I thought she was referring to the early part of October, Mr. Speaker, in the last 4 years, Mr. Speaker. But let's be clear at what happens in this province, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this government, with every contract that is assigned, this Premier, with every contract that I have put my name on, there is absolutely no buyout clause in any of them. Any future government can terminate those employees as they wish, Mr. Speaker. But what happened, Mr. Speaker, when the former NDP government signed contracts? They added very generous severance packages. But, Mr. Speaker, that wasn't good enough. After Nova Scotians told them they no longer wanted them to govern, what did they do? They went to the cabinet room and billed the taxpayers an extra $1 million so that they could give their friends some money on the way out the door.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday I asked the Premier if the position of Chief of Protocol was advertised. He didn't answer. So we know it wasn't. Just a few months ago in this House, Mr. Speaker, the Premier said, and I quote, "The job of government and indeed any Nova Scotian is to be open and honest," and I will table that for the benefit of the House. My question to the Premier, if he truly wanted to find the most qualified person for the job of Chief of Protocol, truthfully, why didn't the position get advertised?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, we've introduced the most open and accountable piece of legislation when it comes to economic development and disbursement of funds, Mr. Speaker, of any government in the history of this country, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we've at every opportunity and every turn, Mr. Speaker, we've told the questions about the contracts that we have signed. Mr. Speaker, I want to be very clear to the people listening to this and the people in the gallery that every contract that this government has signed, every contract that I have put my name on, Mr. Speaker, open and transparent, and there is no buyout clause at the end of them, unlike, Mr. Speaker, what the Conservative leader negotiated for himself just about a decade ago.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I struck that severance position out of my contract and got zero. That's what I did, and I just want to make the record clear. And the reason I did, Mr. Speaker, is because paying off your friends at the beginning of your term is no better than paying them off at the end of your term, like the NDP did. Mr. Speaker, yesterday I asked the Premier if he consulted the Public Service Commission on the hiring of his new friend protocol officer. He didn't answer, so we know he didn't. This is the same Premier who once said in this House, and I will table this, Mr. Speaker, the same Premier who said, Mr. Speaker, it's not too much to ask the Premier to substantiate his comments in the House. So, Mr. Speaker, if it's not too much to ask, who was consulted on the hiring of Ms. Langell? Thank you.
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as I've said many times in this House, we hired a very qualified person to be Chief Protocol Officer in the province of Nova Scotia. We hired him on a contract basis, Mr. Speaker. That contract is she's being paid less than the outgoing Chief Protocol Officer, Mr. Speaker. I want to also remind all members of this House, in case they haven't heard me, there is no buyout at the end of this contract, Mr. Speaker. And just to help clarify what the Leader of the Conservative Party actually did, Mr. Speaker, he left in that buyout clause, Mr. Speaker, just in case, Mr. Speaker, he got fired from that position, Mr. Speaker. That buyout clause of $124,000 was there so that the Leader of the Conservative Party, if he got turfed from his job, had a soft landing.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition on his final supplementary.
You know, Mr. Speaker, in this business, you know who gets turfed from their jobs? People that don't answer simple questions and hold themselves accountable to the people that elected them. Mr. Speaker, yesterday we learned that the only reference collected for Ms. Langell for the position of Chief of Protocol was the Premier himself, who said on YouTube, and I quote again, "Nothing would make me happier than to have her working as part of a Liberal government." Now, Mr. Speaker, that YouTube video mysteriously was taken down late yesterday. So my question to the Premier, who pledges himself to openness and transparency, is if the Premier did nothing wrong, why was the YouTube video removed?
The Honourable Premier.
I'm not sure, but I will try to put it back up for his viewing pleasure if he likes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will endeavour to find out for the honourable member why that video was taken down, Mr. Speaker. But I will tell you, Mr. Speaker, again, there is no buyout at the end of this clause. And if there's one thing we know for certain, Mr. Speaker, is that the Leader of the Conservative Party certainly knows how to look after himself when it comes to negotiating of contracts, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, all I'll say is that this idea that we're all going to get along and cooperate has died a sorry death today. Nothing the Premier said in his answer bears any resemblance to what actually happened, and he either knows it or he needs to find better researchers. Mr. Speaker, the Premier once said, as I pointed out earlier, the job of the government, and indeed any Nova Scotian, is to be open and honest and truthful. There seems to be some uncertainty about when Ms. Langell started with the government. So I will ask the Premier a simple and straightforward question once again. I hope I get a different answer than the canned answer he's given us 12 times already. On what date was Ms. Langell hired, and will he produce a signed copy of her contract before the end of question period today?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I can endeavour to find the answer out for the Leader of the Conservative Party. I can tell you that it was brought to my attention that the hire happened on Monday, but I can confirm that. And the media were told the next day, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we're 17 questions into this, and we finally have at least a little step forward in getting at what actually happened. The Premier said the media was informed on Tuesday. Mr. Speaker, I do find that very interesting for a Premier that said he wants to be upfront with Nova Scotians about this hiring. It's an important ceremonial job. There was no press release. There was no announcement. It was a verbal passing on of information to the media at the end of question period on Tuesday. So my question to the Premier is, if this is all above board and upfront, why was there no announcement made using the usual means of press release and so on?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this government has done a tremendous amount of work on behalf of Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, and unlike previous governments, we don't run down to the press release machine and fill one out and throw it. Matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure where the leader of the Conservative Party comes from. I do want to remind him, Mr. Speaker, that there is no one from CNS who actually is in my office, Mr. Speaker, because unlike previous governments, Mr. Speaker, we want Communications Nova Scotia to stay away from political message, Mr. Speaker, and communicate to Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, and that's what we're going to continue to do, be open and transparent with Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition on his final supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think I just heard the Premier say or acknowledge this was a political appointment, and that's why he didn't want to do a Communications Nova Scotia press release. So now we've made another small step forward. We all know, Mr. Speaker, that if the Premier truly believed he'd done nothing wrong, there would have been a proper press release, there would have been a proper announcement, and there wasn't. Mr. Speaker, all of the hirings under the government's fair hiring policy are subject to Freedom of Information disclosure. The Premier has refused to answer straightforward questions now 18 times here in the House of Assembly in the last 2 days. He has avoided being open and transparent by breaking his own rules around fair hiring policy in the case of the Chief of Protocol. If the Premier truly believes that he did nothing wrong and truly wishes to stand by his own words, which he spoke before the election, that the job of government is to be open and transparent, will the Premier agree to release all documentation and communications about the hiring of Ms. Langell, including her contract, so Nova Scotians can judge for themselves?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will endeavour to see if I can get that information for the Leader of the Conservative Party, but I want to just reassure him, Mr. Speaker, that there was no deal negotiated on behalf of the new Chief Protocol Officer that was negotiated for the Leader of the Conservative Party when he was Chief of Staff, which I want to remind this House was a $124,000 soft landing, Mr. Speaker. Not to mention what his friend, the Prime Minister, provided for him in over $300,000 in payment, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question today is for the Premier. On October 1st, 2013, the Premier, then Leader of the Opposition, wearing a pair of orange-coloured fall flip-flops, told the HRM Council that the province should not be making unilateral decisions on issues that impact HRM, and that, quote, it's the responsibility of the provincial government to respect the decision of Council, and I'll table a copy of the minutes from that Council meeting. On May 21st, 2013, Mr. Speaker, the Premier, this time sporting a pair of yellow-coloured spring flip-flops, wrote to the chair of the Otter Lake Community Monitoring Committee saying, and I quote, it is the position of the Nova Scotia Liberal Caucus that we will not entertain amending the industrial permit nor relaxing provincial legislation or regulations that impact the operation of the Otter Lake landfill. Mr. Speaker, I will also table that. My question for the Premier, since these commitments are obviously in complete contradiction to each other, how do you plan to keep both of these commitments?
The Honourable Premier.
I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question, Mr. Speaker, and I wanted to reassure her that HRM Council, through the great work by the Deputy Mayor, is actually agreeing with the provincial government, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, on Tuesday, November the 12th, HRM Council voted against a motion that would stop controversial changes at the Otter Lake landfill. This means that the HRM Council is moving ahead with plans to eliminate front-end processing and the waste stabilization facility at the landfill, despite overwhelming opposition by local residents. But yesterday, the Environment Minister said in this House, quote, "It is the position of the Department and the Government that we will not entertain modifications to the existing approval." My question to the Premier, given his very public commitment to respect all HRM Council decisions, now that he's Premier, how is he going to keep his commitment to the people of Otter Lake?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister of Environment for the great work he's doing on behalf of all Nova Scotians, but in particular on the residents of HRM, Mr. Speaker, in making sure that they protect that facility and the environment surrounding that facility. Mr. Speaker, what I find very interesting, a question coming from the NDP party about municipal government. That is the same party, Mr. Speaker, that showed disregard for that elected bodies across this province by tearing up a memorandum of understanding and, Mr. Speaker, telling them to take it or leave it. The difference now is, Mr. Speaker, municipal governments across this province are grateful that the people of this province elected a new government, one that wants to work with them and be their partner.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook Salmon River on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to remind the Premier that I'm the critic for the environment, so I'm very interested in the Otter Lake land refill. And Mr. Speaker, also my municipal council in Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook Salmon River and Colchester County is very pleased to see me back in this legislature. So, Mr. Speaker, on April 24th, the former Environment Minister told Mayor Savage in no uncertain terms would HRM be allowed to change the terms of the permit for Otter Lake. At the time, Councillor Steve Adams said, and I quote, "The letter from the minister is quite definitive, and that's what has put this process to an end." I will table that, Mr. Speaker. But, lo and behold, public hearings and council votes on Otter Lake continue. So, Mr. Speaker, my third and final question for the Premier. Has his government told the HRM Mayor and Council that changes to the Otter Lake permit will or will not be considered?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I think the Minister of Environment was very clear here yesterday, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure what part of his response that the member opposite missed, but he was very clear that there would be no changes. We would be respecting the original permit that was put in place and the process that was there. Mr. Speaker, but again, whether she is the Minister or critic for the Environment, Mr. Speaker, she's a member of a former government that showed so little regard for municipal governments across this province that I find it hard to believe there is a single municipal official that is grateful that any New Democrat is back in this House.
The Honourable Member for Colchester, Musquodoboit Valley.
Mr. Speaker, this is a question to the Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage. The Blue Nose has always been, well, it's been in a position of pride for a good many years for Nova Scotians. In a recent question and answer, the Minister said that he hasn't had the time yet to go and see this project. This project eats up half of the funding assets of the department. So my question to the Minister is, why does he not feel it important to see this $16.5 million project firsthand?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the question from my honourable member. I will mention that the costs of this project are quite complicated, and they are a concern. What I will say is that this project is very dear and near to Nova Scotians' heart, to my heart. and it is a project that is going through dock trials right now, and once those dock trials and sea trials are completed, I will be one of the first people there to be on that boat and enjoy it.
The honourable member for Colchester Musqueam Valley on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the project so far has quite an overrun. The original was supposed to be $375,000, but as of September, $1.3 million has been given to the project manager. So does the minister plan to continue to pay the project management costs, which are in the range of $25,000 a month?
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thanks again for that question. We are dealing with a project that for the first time in Nova Scotia in 50 years we're looking at a boat that is being built to the highest standards. We are looking at safety standards. We are looking to make sure that Nova Scotians and the visitors to Nova Scotia get to enjoy this particular ship and get to be safe on the ship. So with the cost overruns, we are ensuring that it is built to the highest standards.
The honourable member for Colchester Musqueam Valley on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the website says a big part of the crew's mission is to share Blue Nose 2 with the public. We certainly are hoping that the Nova Scotians and tourists who come to our province will have the opportunity to really enjoy this boat. So just asking the minister to confirm today that tourists and locals alike will be allowed to see Blue Nose 2 when she's finally finished.
The Honourable Minister of Communities, Culture and Heritage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will answer yes. Nova Scotians and tourists to the province will get to enjoy this particular vessel. They will see how beautiful it is, and they will take pride in what is Nova Scotia's ambassador.
The honourable member for Sydney Whitney Pier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, on November the 8th, the Federal Citizenship and Immigration Minister made big changes to one of Canada's most popular immigration programs, the Canadian Experience Class, what they call the CEC. These changes are bad news for potential immigrants to Nova Scotia. So my question to the minister, could she provide details about the conversation between her and her federal counterpart after she called Ottawa to express her frustration over these short-sighted changes?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. He's addressing me as the Minister of Immigration, so I'll put that hat on at the moment. You're quite correct. There were... You're fine. You're fine. So I'll put that hat on. You're quite correct, member of the opposite. I am immigration, yes. Who's he talking to?
Yeah, you. Yeah, we're all good, guys.
There were various changes made to the CIC Act, and I will certainly attempt to answer your question, but definitely not today. This is a very complicated regulation that has been made to the Act, and I am actually in the process of contacting the federal minister to have a face-to-face meeting with him.
The honourable member for Sydney Whitney Pier on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the changes to CEC include an annual cap of 12,000 new CEC applications and a subcap of 200 applications in certain occupations. But what's most troubling about these changes were the new qualifications regarding who will be excluded from the program. Effective November the 9th, experience in certain jobs will no longer qualify an applicant for the CEC. Jobs like cooks, bookkeepers, food service and retail managers and others. So my question to the Minister of Immigration, Does the minister agree with the Conservatives that people who work in these sorts of occupations deserve less of an opportunity to become Canadians?
Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. This minister is very much concerned about all Canadians and all immigrants to this country, and we definitely will, regardless of the types of positions that they are going to be employed in. And this minister will certainly be addressing these issues and every other types of issues with the federal minister.
Honourable member for Sydney Whitney Pier on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I grew up in a community of immigrants. My community was once the industrial immigration capital of Canada. My question through you, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, since immigration was a large part of the Liberal election platform, what is she going to do to ensure these changes will not have a negative effect on Nova Scotia communities?
The Honourable Minister of Immigration.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I too come from a very rich immigrant community, and in fact, I know a lot of the constituents of the member opposite and his community as well. This minister we will start with an advisory committee to the Premier, and we will soon be able to roll information on that. And I invite the member opposite as well as everyone else in the House, if they have any suggestions or comments, to please speak with me. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, this question through you is for the Minister of Labour and Advanced Education. This month, the Canadian Federation of Independent Business produced a report on the state of apprenticeship in Nova Scotia. Mr. Speaker, I wish I could say it was a positive report, and I'll table that. Instead, it confirmed many of our concerns. We are on track to face a serious labour crisis. With high out-migration, low immigration, and an aging population, things need to change. Young Nova Scotians are looking for leadership to make needed changes to apprenticeships. This is clearly an issue that cannot wait. My question to the Minister, how much longer will small businesses have to suffer until changes are made to apprenticeships?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I would like to welcome the member back to the House after his involuntary sabbatical. The member is correct. There are concerns around the current apprenticeship regime in this province. For example, our apprentices are starting their apprentices 2 years older than the average across the country, and they take longer to actually finish their apprenticeship, about 2 years longer as well. So we do have a problem there with our apprentices. Nova Scotia businesses need workers, and our skilled workers need experience. One of the things that we've discovered is that during a slowdown, we have workers who are not completing their apprenticeship because there's no work for them. So we're actually working with the community college, with business, and we expect to have a new plan very soon. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou Centre on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, after those kind words, I feel like taking the second and third question, maybe putting it to the side. However, Mr. Speaker, I will continue. The Liberal platform suggests that there would be changes to the apprenticeship program in the current year. Nearly half of all small business owners point to apprenticeships as a potential solution to the labour shortage. They are facing many roadblocks, including high costs, poaching risks, information deficiencies, inflexible training arrangements, and provincial inconsistencies across the country. This long list of barriers makes it difficult, if not impossible, for many employers to hire and train apprentices. My question to the Minister, when can small businesses expect some relief?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. Soon, very soon.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government knows this is a serious issue. The opposition certainly knows it's a serious issue. The business community knows it's a serious issue. And certainly the Canadian Federation of Independent Business knows it's a serious issue. Mr. Speaker, 7,000 new skilled tradespeople will be needed in Nova Scotia over the next 7 years. We need more skilled tradespeople, and we need them now. 21% of small business owners in the region point to restrictive ratios as an obstacle in providing apprenticeship training. Without more Nova Scotians training, demand will be difficult to meet, and small business will suffer. My question to the Minister: why does the Minister continue to wait when Nova Scotia jobs and the economy are on the line?
The Honourable Minister of Labour and Advanced Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, we are not waiting. We are moving towards bringing in a special operating agency that will, in fact, have new ratios for apprentices. However, we're not going to do this in a vacuum. We are committed to consulting with business, and my answer still stands. You will see a new apprenticeship regime soon. Thank you.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations. It's December and the weather is getting colder, and we're getting calls about the heating assistant rebate program, and I'm sure the Minister's office is also. However, when they were on this side of the House, the members of the Liberal Party often criticized the previous government, who made changes to ensure more people would qualify for the heating assistant rebate program, saying that the program was inadequate. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the honourable member, has the program heating assistant rebate program been changed to reflect your previous position?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Heating Assistance Rebate Program, as you are aware, was rolled out again this fall. This government has committed $400,000 to assist in that program. We'll continue to monitor the program in support of those who meet the requirements through the application process.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know the honourable member was not here, but that was the criticism from the Liberals with respect to the investment amount. So I will take it that there has been no changes, even though they were very critical about that program. Mr. Speaker, I would like to ask the honourable member with regards to the heating assistant rebate program, and I will table a passage from Hansard from the member from Preston, Dartmouth. He said, and I quote, "Mr. Speaker, $200 doesn't even cover 1/3 of the cost of a fill-up of fuel." I would like to ask the Minister, will the Minister explain why he has kept the heating assistant rebate program application capped at that $200 that they so very much criticized?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the challenges we face in maintaining the program is an upload of new applicants given the expiration of the 3-year period. So it is our intention to continue to monitor the program. The cap rate of $200 at the present time is valuable to recipients. They've indicated that in feedback they've provided. We'll continue with that cap at the present time. We'll continue to monitor it, and depending on the upload, we may in the future be able to adjust that cap.
The honourable member for Chester St. Margaret's on her final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to thank the honourable member for his answer, but I can tell him that there is no requirement to monitor the program. We know that $200, as was criticized by the Liberals when they sat on this side, is not enough for individuals or families because it does not provide enough oil for heat in their homes. So I guess it is different when they sit on the other side. So, Mr. Speaker, the Liberals also promised to decrease nearly every government's department spending by 1%, and that includes the Department of Service, Nova Scotia, and Municipal Relations. That would mean a cut of $250,000. So therefore, I would like to ask the minister, can he tell us where the cuts will come from in his department? Does that mean that the heating assistant program will be cut for the poor, or jobs in his department that help process those very applications?
Your Honourable Minister for Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Coincidentally, I met with the Deputy Minister this morning and we spoke about this very matter. We will be very efficient in how we address the cuts within the department, but I can assure my opposition member that we will be very frugal and very appropriate in addressing this.
The honourable member for Fairview Clayton Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Department of Community Services currently has a satellite intake office in Halifax's North End, making accessibility easier for the residents of that area. My question through you to the Minister of Community Services is, would the Minister be opening to having additional satellite intake offices across the province, and in particular in the Fairview Bayers Road area?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you for that question. Yes, I would be very much open to looking at satellite offices, particularly in the Fairview area where there are approximately 1,300 families on income assistance, and also the Atlantic area, Halifax Atlantic, where there are currently 800 families on income assistance. When I was a single mom and was on income assistance, I actually went to the satellite office in Halifax Atlantic when it was open in the early 90s with my 2-year-old son. And I know that sitting on a bus, well, it would be 2 buses from Halifax Atlantic or to get to Gottingen Street, it would be a hardship. And we want to remove barriers for people who are trying to go on to income assistance, or if they're trying to attach to the labour market through our office. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is going to be to the Minister of Community Services. A recent report by the Ombudsman revealed that Nova Scotia does not have a standard approach to performing background checks for those working with vulnerable persons. The Minister of Community Services is responsible for many programs and services that provide vulnerable Nova Scotians. As such, she should be particularly keen to see this issue resolved. My question to the Minister is then, has the Minister made any immediate changes within the Department to ensure vulnerable people are protected and background checks are done in a standardized fashion?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I'd like to, excuse me, I'd like to thank the Honourable Member for the question. We will be following all the recommendations of the Ombudsman, and from someone who has come from community and working with very vulnerable children and women, that absolutely is a priority in my tenure as Minister of Community Services.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount on his first supplementary.
And thank you for that answer. Now, this is a serious issue, and while legislation is needed to make sure all necessary checks are performed, history has shown us that this is not something we can afford to wait on. The Ombudsman pointed out there are many situations where service providers may not know when a background check is needed. Some do not include criminal record checks, and others do. The inconsistencies can put people at risk. So again, my question is to the Minister of Community Services. Will the Minister require retroactive background checks for those who are not otherwise properly reviewed?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We will be abiding by all the recommendations of the Ombudsman Office, and one of the things that I've currently changed as well is that any volunteers that want to go on any of the ABCs that are directly linked to the Department of Community Services now, for the first time ever, are required to have a background check. I feel very strongly about this. There is absolutely no reason why anyone connected with our department dealing with vulnerable populations do not have a background check.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'll direct this question to the Minister of Justice. As we've seen in situations in the past where an unfit person has been permitted to work with vulnerable Nova Scotians, we need to protect these people. This is an issue that cannot wait. So my question to the Minister of Justice is, will the Minister bring forward legislation this session to ensure that we have a standard approach to protect vulnerable Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Safety and safety of our children, safety of our youth, safety of our families are of the utmost importance for us at Justice. We will work with Community Services and every other department to review what we currently have, and we'll work with our office, and we'll be able to, if the case determines that we need to update or amend any legislation, we'll look into that. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East. Pictou East.
Sorry, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Finance. The Premier has tasked the Minister of Finance with responsibility for overseeing the province's finances. This is an incredibly important task and indeed no small job. I know that the Minister is up to the task because she has been watching the province's finances for quite some time. In fact, last April, while in opposition, the Minister expressed a lot of concern over the NDP's budget. Mr. Speaker, many Nova Scotians shared the Minister's concern about the budget. Many Nova Scotians questioned whether it was actually balanced or not, and they are now anxious to see how the actual results are comparing to the expectations of the budget. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister is, can we expect an update on the budget situation to be released before the House rises?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for that question. Certainly this is something that I know is important to all Nova Scotians, to see what the state of the finances are, and we are waiting right now for a little bit more information. As the members will know, we've received new information on the economy and the growth, or in fact, in some cases, negative growth in the economy. Some of the difficulties have been the outflow of people, a decline in population, and higher unemployment. We, in the Finance Department, we take all of that information to make our forecasts and to see where we're at during the year. So right now, we're waiting on one further piece of information on HST.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East on his first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for her answer, and I'm glad to hear she's compiling additional information because, as we know, we all hear statistics over and over about the state of the province. We hear numbers like $14 billion in debt and depreciating infrastructure and 11,000 fewer jobs as compared to 4 years ago. In fact, we hear those numbers so much that they may start to lose their impact on some of us, but of course not on me with my fascination for numbers. But Nova Scotians do deserve to know the truth about our financial situation. And while in opposition, one aspect of the NDP budget that the Minister seemed particularly worried about were the NDP's financial revenue projections. So my question for the Minister is, now after having 50 days to look at the books, is the Minister confident that when she gets this final piece of information, the forthcoming update will provide this House, and in fact all Nova Scotians, with a true representation of our bottom line, and that Nova Scotians can rely on?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you again for that question. The question's very good. Will it be a true representation? And that's something I can assure the members of this House that it will be. We want to make sure everything is transparent and open. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, unlike the two parties in opposition, this government did not promise to lower the HST when we did not have money in the budget to do that. I think that's very important. What I see already with the revenue projections are clearly there is not money in the budget to lower the HST, as both opposition parties promised. It was irresponsible to do so, particularly for the NDP, who knew very well what the province's budget was like. Thank
you. The honourable member for Pictou East on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I again thank the Minister for her answer, and I'm glad to hear that they're going to try and be prudent with the province's finances, although in their platform they promised many millions of dollars of spending with really no way to substantiate how they would afford them. But it's one thing I want to clarify. One question I would like to clarify this afternoon is last winter, the Minister spoke a number of times about the NDP's prepayment of universities and other fiscal shell games. My sense is that the Minister was deeply uncomfortable with the practice of the prior government that saw expenses shifted between fiscal years. And I am also uncomfortable by this practice and worry that it is misleading to Nova Scotians. So my question today for the Minister is, knowing that while in opposition the Liberal Party disagreed with the practice of prepaying universities, will the Minister commit that there will be no prepayments or shifting of expenses around fiscal periods in this financial update?
Honourable Minister of Finance.
Certainly not in this update. Thank you very much for the question again, Mr. Speaker. This issue won't arise in the update because that was something that happened in the budget. It was a payment made by the NDP government at the time to load extra money into the previous year's deficit in order to show what they called a balanced budget for this current year. My fiscal update will show where we're at this year going forward and how it's unfolding. And as I said, I have some real concerns about the revenue estimates. I believe I was right when I spoke here in the House when the budget was introduced. The forecast estimates were rosy, to say the least. They took the most optimistic possible scenarios in order to build the revenue into the budget. And I think when I point out the recent economic information that's coming in, not least of which is a declining population, which will be equivalent to millions of dollars less in transfer payments from the federal government, all of those figures are pointing to the fact that the NDP government inflated their revenue figures.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this past Saturday was dumping day for lobster fishers in districts fishing areas 33 and 34. And if the catches in them districts 35 are any indication, they can expect another plentiful harvest this year. Unfortunately, as fishers know far too well, large harvests may bring down or have low prices. My question is to the Minister of Fisheries and Agriculture. Now that the new CETA agreement has been signed, what steps is this new government taking to increase demand for Nova Scotia lobster on the European market?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture, Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a very important topic that the former Minister of Fisheries brings up. It's very important that we move forward in marketing our product as a quality product from Canada, and we're in the process of working out an arrangement with the other provinces in the province, as a member would know, to achieve that. But it's going to be a long, difficult road. There's many issues that have to be addressed that have been outstanding for more than 4 years.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Minister for his previous question, and I don't know if he managed to get down to the wharf on dumping day, but in any case he didn't. I can tell you that in southwest Nova Scotia the temperature was low, but the enthusiasm was high. My question to the Minister: it's been demonstrated over and over again that MSC certification is extremely important to the European consumer. In May of this year, my NDP government committed to funding MSC certification for the Nova Scotia lobster industry. Can the minister provide an update on how the certification process is currently going on, and will he commit to that financial commitment that we did previously? Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We are working towards that certification, which is critical towards the industry, and we hopefully will have it in place as soon as possible.
The honourable member for Queen Shelburne on his final supplementary.
Again, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the minister for his answer. MSC certification is not a quick or inexperienced process. It will likely take several years before Nova Scotia lobster receives certification. My final question, given the significance of MSC, will the minister...
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions to the ministers has expired. We'll now move on to orders of the day, and I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, would you please call public bills for second reading?
Government bills for second reading.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 9, Accountability and Economic Development Assistance Act.
Bill number 9, an act to ensure accountability and providing economic development assistance in Nova Scotia. I recognize the Honourable House Leader.
Thank you, Mr.